At 7:12 a.m. that Thursday, 2 downstream plants dropped into quality hold, cascading delays spreading through $100 million in parts commitments, frozen behind one missing signature. Mine. I was on my porch in Kettering, coffee in hand, watching sprinklers tick across a lawn I finally had time to notice. My phone had been buzzing since 7:17, the board's version of cost savings, most likely. Somewhere in a trust account with my name on it sat $691,000. 19 years of bonuses, set aside one deposit at a time for 2 grandchildren's college tuition, 6 years still to go. I let the phone buzz. My name is Marcus Nolan. I'm 56. I spent 27 years running production floors before Oak Ridge Novum hired me 19 years ago to fix a plant nobody else wanted, and for the last 9 of those years, I built the operations governance system. Every clause, every threshold, that quietly kept every one of our facilities certified, on schedule, and out of the newspapers. 3 days earlier, in a policy shift the board approved without asking me a single question, they'd renamed my badge. Chief Operations Officer became Senior Operations Advisor, reporting to a 29-year-old who hadn't walked a production floor before 9 months ago. The formal reassignment of what I actually signed off on, somehow, never made it onto anyone's paperwork. The coffee had gone lukewarm. Behind me, in the garage, sat a dog-eared procedure binder I'd carried out of that building in a cardboard box 3 days earlier, because nobody had thought to ask for it back. Cracked spine. My handwriting in the margins going back 9 years, in blue ink, faded closer to gray than I'd realized. I hadn't asked for a demotion. I hadn't caused what was happening at Bikant that morning, either, not with my own 2 hands. I'd simply stopped being the person anyone consulted before they made a decision. That distinction was about to matter to a great many people who currently had no idea it existed. The phone buzzed again against the porch rail, a flat rattling sound against the wood. I looked at the screen, the chairman's assistant, then Noah, then the chairman again, and set it face down without answering. Somewhere behind that string of missed calls sat 2 OEM account managers who had spent a decade emailing me directly, never HR. They would call the number they'd always called. 19 years teaches you the sound a hydraulic press makes right before it fails. It teaches you which vendors cut corners on heat treat certifications, which auditors actually read the binders they're handed, and which clause in a 9-year-old governance charter still carried my name on the one line that mattered. I hadn't opened that charter in months. I didn't need to. I'd written it, line by line, sitting across a folding table from a man named Boris Adler, who believed a company's real infrastructure was never the machines. Somewhere at Bikant that morning, a press line that had run clean for 6 years was sitting dark under a containment tag, and a young man who called manual sign-off legacy thinking was about to learn what 9 years of undocumented thresholds actually cost to rebuild from scratch. I finished the coffee. Still cold. I didn't mind. 3 days earlier, none of them had thought any of it would matter. By the time my phone finally stopped buzzing that morning, the clock had already started, and there wasn't a dashboard in that building that could tell them how much time they had left. 9 years earlier, I sat across a folding table from Boris Adler with 2 cups of vending machine coffee going cold between us, writing the rules that would eventually run every plant in the Oak Ridge Novum network. Boris was vice chairman by then, already gray, already the only board member who still walked a production floor before he read a spreadsheet. He'd hired me a decade before that. He tapped his mechanical pencil twice against the table before he said anything he meant. Write down everything you know that isn't written down anywhere, he told me. Then make sure nobody can quietly erase your name off of it. I took him literally. Over the next 9 years, I built what the company eventually called the Operations Governance Charter. Thresholds for torque specs, heat treat tolerances, vendor substitutions, containment triggers, all of it cross-referenced against our IETF 16949 certification and the PPAP files each OEM required before they'd take a single part off our line. Most of it lived in a binder because most of it never fit cleanly into a database field. I didn't need a dashboard to tell me a press was drifting out of spec. After 27 years, I could hear it in the rhythm of the strike, feel it through the floor before the sensor caught up. The binder sat on my desk for 9 years, then in a box on my porch. Same binder, same handwriting. I never digitized more than half of it, and the half I did digitize was written in language dry enough that nobody downstream ever bothered reading past the first page. That was never an accident. Boris had taught me that, too. Vicant carried the heaviest certification load in the network, cold-forged components for 2 aerospace primes, and a Tier 1 automotive account worth more than the rest of the plants combined. Every deviation from spec required a sign-off from a single named authority under the charter. For 9 years, that name was mine. Nobody at Oak Ridge Novum had ever needed to think about who held that designation, the same way nobody thinks about a load-bearing wall until someone decides to knock it out. 2 weeks before the reorg, a floor tech named Callie found me checking a torque reading by hand instead of trusting the sensor array. "You know the app does that now," she said, not unkindly. I told her the app was usually right. Usually wasn't the same as always, and always was what our OEM contracts required. She laughed, called me the last man in America who still owned a tape measure, and went back to her line. Being that man was the whole job. What none of them called outdated yet, what none of them had even noticed, was the one clause in that charter nobody had ever bothered to formally reassign. Not when they cut my title. Not when they cut my staff. Somebody would have had to sit down, read Section 4, and file a board resolution naming a replacement sign-off authority. Nobody had. I hadn't reminded them. It wasn't my job anymore to remind them of anything. I finished my coffee that morning 9 years ago and told Boris the binder would outlast both of us. He tapped his pencil once, which was as close as he came to agreeing with a compliment. What we'd built quietly kept running for 9 more years after that conversation. What they called outdated was about to become unavailable, and neither of them had thought to check the one page that said so. Noah Vincent walked onto the Vicant floor exactly once that first week, holding a tablet instead of a clipboard, angled so the light slid across a dashboard he called the Pulse. He never set it down. He didn't shake hands with the line leads. He greeted me like we hadn't already spent 40 minutes in HR watching a slideshow about my new title. "Marcus, good, you're here." He said it the way you'd greet a vendor. "I wanted you to see the framework in person before we roll it out company-wide." "What framework?" "Operational velocity." He turned the tablet toward me. Colored bars, a scrolling feed of numbers with no units attached. Real-time throughput, real-time defect signal, real-time everything. No more waiting on a binder to tell us what already happened an hour ago. "The binder tells you what's about to happen," I said. "That's the part it's good at. That's legacy thinking, and I mean that with respect." He smiled the kind of smile that had never once had to apologize for being wrong. "The board didn't bring me in to keep doing things the way they've always been done. Who's certified to authorize a spec deviation on this line if I'm not in the building?" He didn't know. I watched him not know it. A half-second pause, eyes flicking to the tablet like the Pulse might have an opinion on sign-off authority. It didn't. "The system flags anomalies automatically," he said instead. "We don't really need a human bottleneck for that anymore. That bottleneck has a name. It's in Section 4. I've read Section 4. Then tell me who it names." He didn't answer that directly. "Look, nobody's trying to erase what you built, Marcus. We're modernizing how we access it. That's all this is. Modernizing isn't the same as reassigning. Did the board file a resolution naming a new authority, or did somebody just assume the tablet counts? The tablet is the authority now. That's the whole point of the Pulse. A press 2 lines over cycled, metal striking metal. Neither of us looked at it. 27 years teaches you which sounds need your eyes and which ones don't. "You should walk this floor before you decide what it needs," I said. "I don't have to walk it. I have the data. The data's usually right. Usually isn't always. Always is what your OEM contracts actually require. With respect, Marcus, that's exactly the mindset we're moving past." I asked one more question, the only one that mattered standing on a floor I'd walked longer than he'd been alive. Was there a version of modernizing that didn't quietly remove the one signature standing between this plant and a very expensive mistake? He checked the Pulse instead of answering, thumbed past it like a notification he'd get to later. I don't know if anyone was still listening by then, but if a story like this is worth your time, staying with us is what keeps these stories coming. A new one every day. "Any other concerns?" he asked, already turning toward the exit. "I'll let you know when you make a decision worth having one about." He laughed like I'd made a joke. I went back to the line, where the press was already telling me something the Pulse never would. That was the first document they should have read, and it wasn't on any tablet. It was 40 pages long, cracked at the spine, sitting in a box in my garage by the following Monday. The reorg meeting happened at 8:10 on a Monday morning, in the small conference room with the bad chairs, not the boardroom. That detail told me most of what I needed to know before anyone said a word. The chairman opened a folder he didn't need to read from. Marcus, we're restructuring operations leadership. Noah's stepping into COO. We'd like you to move into an advisory capacity, senior operations advisor, reporting to him. I capped my pen and set it down. Effective when? Today. Noah said it before the chairman could. We think it's the right move for the business. Streamlines decision-making. It also saves about $600,000 a year in comp and support staff. The chairman added, like he was offering me a consolation prize instead of the actual reason. I nodded once. I'd like that in writing, specifically whether the sign-off authority designation under the governance charter transfers to Noah as part of this, or stays open. The chairman looked at Noah. Noah looked at his tablet. It's an operational role, Noah said. I don't think we need a separate document for a job title. I'm not asking about a job title. I'm asking about a designation on file with our IETF certification. It's a 15-minute conversation with legal. We can circle back on that. I'd like it documented that I asked, I said, and that the answer, today, is that nobody knows. Nobody wrote anything down. It's just paperwork, Marcus, Noah said, tapping the tablet once. Legacy thinking, worrying about a form nobody's looked at in years. Somebody looked at it 9 years ago and put my name on it, I said. That's usually how forms end up matching. The chairman cleared his throat and moved on to severance language I already knew by heart, having written half the company's HR policy myself a decade earlier. Noah added that they'd want me available to help Noah get up to speed. Unpaid overtime dressed up as a favor between colleagues. I'm still salaried through Friday, I said. After that, any of my time belongs to me. That seems a little rigid, Noah said. For someone who built this place. I built it on the clock. I'll keep protecting it on the clock. That's not rigid. That's the same rule I've followed for 19 years. The chairman slid a single sheet across the table. New title, new reporting line, same salary band minus the operations premium. I read it once, top to bottom, the way I read every document that mattered. Then I signed it. Not because I agreed with it. Because refusing to sign wouldn't have changed a single fact underneath it. And I've never confused a signature with a surrender. We appreciate you handling this so professionally, the chairman said. I generally do, I said. It's on the record now. That's all I wanted. I stood, straightened my chair the way I always did, and walked back to my office. The smaller one, 3 doors down from the one I'd had that morning. On my way out, Noah called after me. Something about setting up a sync for Thursday. I said I'd check my calendar. I didn't check my calendar. That would have been bad enough on its own. But the joint certification audit for our largest automotive account was already on the books for Thursday morning at Bikent. The same renewal review that had cleared every year for 9 years under my signature. And nobody in that building yet understood they were about to walk into it blind. That Monday evening, I sat at my kitchen table and opened the binder for the first time since carrying it out of the building. To HR, it was an old 3-ring binder nobody had thought to collect. To me, it was the only complete copy of 9 years of thresholds that had never made it into any database Oak Ridge Novum owned. I photographed every page. Not to hide anything. I'd never touched a system I wasn't authorized to touch, and I wasn't about to start now. I photographed my own personal property, on my own kitchen table, on my own time, and saved the files to a drive that had never once connected to a company network. That was the only active thing I did that entire evening. Documentation. Nothing else. The rule itself was simple, and I'd written it that way on purpose. Section 4 of the Operations Governance Charter. Any production deviation at Bikent required sign-off from the named sign-off authority before it could proceed. Any deviation approved without that sign-off was automatically invalid under our IETF 16949 system, voiding the batch's PPAP-approved status the moment it happened. No exceptions, no manual override. I hadn't invented the automatic part. The certification body had. I'd simply made sure the charter said so in writing and made sure my name was the only one on that line. That name had never been reassigned. Not when they renamed my badge. Not when they gave my office to a 29-year-old with a tablet. There was a second piece nobody outside that binder understood yet, and I wasn't going to explain it to anyone that night, including you. It mattered less what the rules said than when somebody finally read it. The charter had one more feature, added at Boris's insistence in year 3. Any replacement sign-off authority required a minimum 90-hour certification window, training on Baiken's specific tolerances, sign-off from 2 outside auditors, a formal board resolution. Nobody could simply appoint a name and have it take effect by lunchtime. Boris had built that clause after a competitor lost a federal contract by rushing a replacement in overnight. Speed kills, he told me once, tapping his pencil. Especially the kind you can't undo. I didn't call anyone that evening. I didn't warn Noah, and I didn't warn the chairman. Warning them wasn't my job anymore. They'd been clear about that themselves, that morning, in writing. What I did instead was ordinary, almost dull. I cross-referenced my photograph pages against my own memory, checking for gaps, the way I'd done every quarter for 9 years out of habit rather than requirement. Page by page, I ran my thumb down the margin notes, smelling the same stale toner smell that Binder had carried for years. I found the torque tolerance table for the automotive account's new bracket design, added 8 months earlier after a near-miss nobody, but Brian Ishida, and I remembered clearly. A supplier substitution that looked identical on paper and behaved nothing like the original underload. I recited the tolerance before my eyes reached the number, 42 Newton meters, plus or minus 1.5. No exceptions for cold starts. I read it twice anyway. Old habit. Then I closed the binder and set it on the counter, spine up. Outside, a neighbor's sprinkler kicked on, ticking against the same fence line it always did. Ordinary sound, ordinary night. By then, the binder was already sitting exactly where it would need to be found. Not hidden, not smuggled, just quietly, legally, entirely out of reach. Tuesday morning, Noah held an all-hands in the Baiken cafeteria to launch operational velocity company-wide. I wasn't invited. My new office didn't have a calendar invite to much of anything that week. Brian Ishida told me about it afterward, in the flat, careful way he told me most things. He said the Pulse would cut deviation review time by 90%, Brian said. Got applause for it. Corporate comms filmed it for the newsletter. Did he say what happens to the other 10%? He said the system catches everything that matters. He also said, and I wrote this down, because I didn't trust myself to remember it right, we're not going to let a binder slow down a 9-figure account. I didn't respond to that. A man who calls a governance system a binder in front of his own quality manager has already decided which parts of the job he doesn't intend to learn. By Wednesday, the rollout reached the floor. At 9:40 that morning, a supplier substitution came through on the automotive bracket line. Same part number, different mill. Under Section 4, any material substitution required sign-off authority review before the line could run it. Noah approved it himself, through the Pulse, in under 4 minutes, without routing it anywhere near the name still listed on that section. Brian flagged it that afternoon. He'd pulled the torque readings on the first hour's run and found them drifting outside tolerance. Not enough to trip an alarm. Just enough that a man who'd read that page as many times as I had would have stopped the line. He brought it to Noah directly. These are running high, Brian said. Not out of spec yet. Trending. It's within the Pulse's acceptable range, Noah said. The old tolerance was overly conservative anyway. That's legacy thinking, honestly. That tolerance came from a near miss 8 months ago. Then it did its job 8 months ago. We don't need to keep paying for a problem that's already solved. Do you want me to loop in Marcus? He wrote that spec. I want you to trust the data, Brian. That's the whole point of the Pulse. Noah didn't look up from the tablet. If it were actually a problem, it would be flagged red. It's yellow. Yellow means watch it, not stop the line. Yellow's never been our threshold. Red's the alarm. Yellow was always supposed to mean call somebody. Then I'm telling you, as the person who can actually authorize that call, we're fine. Log it if it makes you feel better. I will, Brian said. For the record, not for you. Whatever gets you through the day. Noah smiled and turned back to the Pulse. Brian logged it and moved on. Stopping the line wasn't his call anymore. He didn't call me. That wasn't his responsibility either. He told me all of this 3 days later, in a coffee shop, still visibly unhappy in a way his voice never quite let show. I should have called you anyway, he said. I didn't think it was my place. I told him it wasn't. That didn't make either of us feel better about it. The celebration lasted through Wednesday's wrap-up call, where Noah credited the Pulse with the fastest changeover in Baiken's history. Replacing the authority he'd quietly bypassed would have taken a minimum of 90 hours under the very charter he'd just ignored. and he spent that entire window congratulating himself on the minutes he'd saved instead. At 7:12 a.m. Thursday, the automotive accounts certification auditors arrived at Baiken early, the way they always did, and pulled the torque logs before their coffee had cooled. By 7:40, they'd found the drifted readings Brian had logged 3 days earlier. By 8:05, the plant's own quality system did exactly what I'd built it to do 9 years ago. Cross-checked the deviation against Section 4, found no valid sign-off authority attached, and automatically voided the batch's certification status. 2 downstream plants that had already received the substituted brackets went into quality hold within the hour. I was in my garage when Brian called, close enough to 7:30 that I still had coffee left. "They're saying the whole batch is invalid," he said. "Not flagged. Invalid. Corporate's asking who authorized the substitution. They already know who authorized it. They're asking who was supposed to. That's not a question I owe an unpaid answer to anymore, Brian. I figured. Thought you'd want to know anyway." By 9, Brian called again. "Legal's involved now," he said. The automotive accounts supply chain director called the chairman directly. Used the words material misrepresentation. "I've heard you use those exact words in a contract review. Word for word. I wrote that clause," I said. "Doesn't surprise me they're quoting it back." By 10:30, a second OEM, the aerospace prime sharing Baiken's line capacity, placed an automatic supply hold of its own, standard procedure whenever a shared facility triggered a quality event. 2 accounts down before lunch, Brian said. "Noah's asking everyone if you've called back yet." "I haven't called anyone." I told him that. He didn't love the answer. "That's not really my problem today," he said, and I'm quoting him directly. "Tell Marcus this is bigger than a title dispute." It was never a title dispute. Tell him I said that, if you want. Or don't. Doesn't change anything either way. I spent that stretch of the morning recalibrating a torque wrench I hadn't touched in months, checking it against the reference gauge the way I'd trained every technician at Baiken to do, then tightening 4 bolts on a bookshelf bracket that had been loose since spring. Around noon, Brian called, the CFO shouting into a speakerphone behind him. "We're bleeding about $94,000 an hour," the CFO said, a figure built off the penalty clauses tied to that 9-figure exposure on the automotive line alone. "That's before the aerospace hold even hits our numbers. You hearing this?" Brian asked me. "I'm hearing it. You got anything to say?" "Not today." By 1, the chairman's assistant called my cell directly for the first time in 4 days. I let it go to voicemail. By 2, Noah called from a number I didn't recognize. "His own phone must be dead," Brian said, calling right after. "He's borrowing someone's." "Wouldn't surprise me. Are you going to pick up next time?" "No. I didn't call anyone back. I didn't offer a fix, and I didn't repeat a warning I'd already given once, in writing, 3 days earlier, to a room that hadn't wanted it documented. I finished the last bolt, wiped the wrench down, and set it back on its hook. By 3, Brian called one last time. "Someone finally pulled Section 4 up on the boardroom screen," he said, reading it out loud, slowly, like people read something they wish they'd read a week ago. The system hadn't failed. It had obeyed the charter, exactly the way it was built to. They came to the house at 4:40 that Thursday afternoon. The chairman, Noah, and Boris Adler, who I hadn't seen in person since my last day in the building. I let them into the kitchen, still smelling faintly of that morning's coffee. Nobody sat down. Noah's shirt had come untucked on one side. The first time I'd seen him look anything less than assembled. "Marcus, we need you back at Baiken tonight," the chairman said. "Whatever this is about titles, we can revisit it. Just help us get the line running." "You're still technically on payroll through tomorrow," Noah added, tapping his tablet like it might back him up. "That should count for something." "It counts for exactly what my job description says it counts for," I said. "Senior Operations Advisor. You wrote the description yourselves. It doesn't include emergency authorization on a line I have no active sign-off standing on." "That's a technicality," Noah said. "The whole operational velocity framework was built to get past exactly this kind of legacy thinking. You know exactly what needs fixing. So does Section 4. It's not a technicality. It's your own certification system doing precisely what it was built to do." Boris tapped his pencil twice against the counter. "Marcus wrote that system at this board's request 9 years ago, specifically so it couldn't be bypassed by one executive's confidence in a dashboard." He looked at Noah, not unkindly, the way you'd look at a mistake you'd made yourself once. You didn't skip a formality. You skipped the one control this company paid 9 years to build. With respect, Noah said, I still don't think one missing signature should be able to freeze a $100 million operation. It's not one signature, I said. It's the only signature your own quality system will accept. I didn't design it to be convenient. I designed it to be correct. Noah tried once more. Even if that's technically true, you could authorize an emergency exception tonight. Verbally. We'd document it after. There's no verbal exception in Section 4. There never was. I wrote it that way on purpose, because verbal exceptions are how companies lose federal contracts. I let that sit. And even if there were one, I'm not the sign-off authority anymore in any capacity you've formally recognized. You made sure of that 4 days ago. Noah opened his mouth to answer and didn't. I watched the color go out of his face, slow and complete, the tablet suddenly still in his hand instead of angled toward anyone. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower kept running, indifferent to all of it. Boris broke the silence. The company will need to formally recertify a new sign-off authority per the charter's own 90-hour provision with outside auditors, he said, to the chairman, not to me. That's the terms, not because Marcus is demanding them, because that's what we signed 9 years ago. And if we just wait it out, the chairman asked. Then the aerospace account walks, and the automotive account fines us for every day past their own contractual grace period, Boris said. That's not Marcus's doing. That's the math. Nobody asked me anything else. I confirmed, when Boris asked directly, that the charter's language was exactly as written and that nothing in it had been altered since the day we filed it. That was the only fact I offered all evening. For what it's worth, the chairman said at the door, I'm sorry it went this way. I believe you, I said. It still went this way. The charter kept working exactly as written, even after every one of them had stopped believing it would. On Friday morning, an email arrived from a regional industrial group I'd spoken with exactly twice, both times at their request. The offer was formal, specific, and $33,000 higher than what Oak Ridge Novum had been paying its chief operations officer 4 days earlier. A regional CEO role, full operational authority, no dashboard called the pulse anywhere in the org chart. I wrote my resignation the same afternoon. 2 sentences. I am resigning my position as Senior Operations Advisor, effective immediately. Thank you for 19 years. I read it once, found nothing else that needed saying, and sent it. Nobody called to talk me out of it. There wasn't anything left to negotiate that Boris hadn't already settled the night before, standing in my kitchen with the terms he'd stated himself. A formally recertified sign-off authority, outside auditors, 90 hours minimum, exactly as the charter required. I started at Holbrook the following Monday. My new office had a window facing the loading dock instead of a parking lot, and I spent the first morning walking the floor before I ever opened a laptop, the way I always had, listening for the sounds that told me more than any dashboard could. Nobody there had ever heard the word legacy used as an insult. It was strange, at first, being asked what I thought before a decision got made instead of after. 3 weeks later, Brian told me Oak Ridge Novum had brought in an outside consulting firm to reverse engineer what I'd built at a rate of $15,300 a week, just to keep Baiken's certifications from lapsing again while they searched for someone qualified to hold the designation permanently. Nobody had asked me to write that number down anywhere. It found its way to me anyway, the way most numbers at that company eventually had. Noah stayed on for a while, reassigned to a role with a long title and no line authority. Director of Digital Transformation Initiatives, according to the company directory, his name quietly removed from Baiken's org chart within the month. I heard he kept the tablet. I don't know what he uses it for now. I still have the binder. It sits on a shelf in my new office at Holbrook, spine facing out, the same cracked spine it's always had. I haven't needed to open it in weeks. My new operations team writes their own thresholds now, in their own language, and I let them, the same way Boris once let me. The trust for my grandchildren finished funding itself last month, 6 years ahead of schedule, thanks to a signing arrangement Holbrook offered that Oak Ridge Novum never once considered. Tuition is handled, every semester of it, and I no longer check that balance out of habit the way I used to. That was never really the number that mattered most to me. It was just the one I could count. I ran into Noah once, months later, at an industry conference neither of us expected the other to attend. He looked thinner, quieter, genuinely trying to ask an intelligent question about supplier qualification instead of a buzzword. I answered it plainly, the way I would have answered anyone. He thanked me. I told him it was nothing, and meant it. That wasn't revenge. Revenge would have required me to do something. All I ever did was stop doing something for free, and let a system I'd spent 9 careful years building keep the one promise it was built to keep, whether anyone in that boardroom believed in it or not.